Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today's Salt Bitcoin Review. My name is Jason Zenz. I'm a partner at SkyBridge Capital, and your guest moderator today, Anthony Scaramucci and John Darcy, will be back. But excited to be here with a number of very important topics and recent events, developments to talk about in the Bitcoin world, joined by a familiar face on these reviews, Brett Messing, President and Chief Operating Officer of SkyBridge. As many of you know, we'll run through some of the relevant topics in the Bitcoin world and also take questions. So as a reminder, you can ask a question using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. And before we dive in, just a quick announcement. As you probably saw in our newsletter, the SALT conference is back. Registration is now open for SALT New York 2021, which will take place in New York City at the Javits Center, September 13th through 15th. Again, registration is now open, and you can go to our website, salt.org, for more information. So with that being said, let's dive right in. A number of exciting topics to touch on, as I mentioned, but Brett, why don't we start with really the Bitcoin conference down in Miami from this weekend. And one of many exciting developments to come out of that was Jack Mallers, the founder of Strike, who announced over the weekend that El Salvador would become the first sovereign nation to make Bitcoin legal tender. Over the last couple of days, that has developed further, with that becoming law overnight. So let's start there, Brett. What is the significance of this small country of El Salvador adopting Bitcoin as legal tender?
Well, before I answer that, I think as everyone knows, I'm a hodler with a multi-year view on Bitcoin, and I try to avoid short-term price, forecasts. But I think Anthony and John bailing on the weekly review means we've put in a bottom. Okay, so I want everyone to track the price. I'm saying, like, for those short-term traders amongst you, I think now's a good time to buy.
Jason Zen's bottom, let's call it.
All right, then we'll call it that. Look, it's a super significant event for symbolic reasons, but beyond that, for very practical reasons. Bitcoin is now legal tender in a foreign country, and that has implications for U.S. commercial law. It has implications potentially for how it's accounted for on companies' balance sheets. So one thing that Michael Saylor is working on is he's trying to get FASB to change the tax treatment of Bitcoin on his balance sheet, because it's presently treated as an intangible. And so what that means is that if you own Bitcoin on a corporate balance sheet and it goes up, you don't mark it up, but if it goes below your cost basis, you mark it down. So it's asymmetrically bad. If you own a foreign currency, like a yen or euro or any foreign currency, you get mark-to-market accounting, okay? And just simply by El Salvador recognizing Bitcoin, it could have changed the accounting treatment of Bitcoin. But, beyond that, what we've seen since Sunday is leaders from nations throughout Central and South America saying they want to do likewise. We've seen a number of companies say they're going to be moving to El Salvador. And what's really happening is El Salvador is doing what Miami is doing and what Texas is doing, right? They are attracting, business, right, which is going to, ultimately benefit their economy. And so what's happening? Paraguay is responding, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, that's going to want this talent. And you mentioned this announcement was made in the Miami Bitcoin conference. And I've spoken to a lot of people who are down there. And, it is a bit of a Bitcoin Burning Man. There's a lot of partying that goes on. But just the amount of talent and capital that is pouring into the Bitcoin ecosystem is human capital, and actually, financial capital is just really unbelievable. Just yesterday, we were discussing that, BlockFi is raising, I think, $500 million in a round led by Dan Loeb. We understand that SoftBank might be making a substantial investment as well. Everything that's happening in this space is just really accelerating. I guess, what was your reaction to that?
Well, I was watching it live actually from Central Park, and Jack Mahler's very emotional about the announcement. The background there for those that don't know, Jack has been down in El Salvador for the last number of months, living and working at what's called Bitcoin Beach, which is this small beach town in El Salvador that a number of years ago decided to fully adopt Bitcoin, and so through applications like Jack Mahler's Strike and others built on the Lightning Network, that community has been living and transacting exclusively with Bitcoin. And it seems clear that the president and others in El Salvador took notice, and it's likely that that was a significant part of this move by El Salvador is that sort of proof of concept, even at a small scale. So you've now seen a number of developments since then, both in the country as well as you mentioned, from other politicians throughout the region. So why don't we take a step back a little bit and Brett, maybe touch on why these countries are adopting Bitcoin, right? A lot of them are in similar situations where they don't control their own monetary policy. They're really pegged to the US dollar. And with all of the dollar printing and devaluation that's gone on, it's had a big negative impact on these countries. So why don't you touch on what the actual macroeconomic benefits are likely to be from this move?
I think, Jason, the story starts earlier than that, which is if you think about, go back 100 years, 2/3 of the world is colonized by Western Europe. Right. And then we have an independence movement, all of Africa. These are young nations everywhere. And as you said, they develop their own currencies, and almost uniformly, they failed at managing their own currencies. I mean, El Salvador has failed to such a degree, right, that they use the US dollar. That's the official currency in El Salvador. But what happens is that we've weaponized the dollar after 9/11, and I think we've taken it to a large extent that is not serving U.S. interests. So, as an example, the El Salvador president, who's now become my favorite green pro-Bitcoin dictator, he was elected democratically, but he has demonstrated some autocratic tendencies. He fired the attorney general. He cleaned out some Supreme Court justices, and so the U.S. was moving to hold back some IMF money that El Salvador needed. These countries feel like they're economic colonies now, even if they're no longer political colonies. Okay, there's just a culture, right, where they don't want to be controlled by any empire. It's not just the U.S. And so the idea of a money, right, that can't be screwed up by a government and isn't controlled by a foreign nation, right, is incredibly intuitive, appealing to these people. I think, as we've discussed previously, the first country to really embrace Bitcoin, and there was a fintech executive named Wences Casares, who's considered to be patient zero, who brought Bitcoin to Silicon Valley, and people like Chamath and Peter Thiel and Reid Hoffman credit him with introducing them to Bitcoin. He lived through, and many Argentinians have, every decade, their net worth just goes away, right? Because the currency collapses. So Bitcoin doesn't seem risky when owning your country's currency seems like, a 90, 100% chance that it's going to get completely destroyed. So I think, staying with the geopolitical theme, this is a domino, right? I think you're going to see this happen throughout South America and Central America, throughout Africa, the Caribbean nations, parts of Southeast Asia. And I think it's super exciting for Bitcoin. I think I might have mentioned this on a prior Bitcoin review show, but at the MicroStrategy conference, when Ross Stevens and Michael Saylor were speaking, Michael Saylor asked, what's the next chapter for Bitcoin? And Ross said, well, the first decade was Bitcoin the asset. Okay, I would argue that we're still in the very beginning of Bitcoin the asset, but that notwithstanding, Ross has been around Bitcoin longer than I have. And the next The next chapter is Bitcoin, the network. Okay, and I think this is a movement there. And just last point on this, 22% of El Salvador's economy is remittances. The remittance market is huge. And everyone talks about all the fancy things that Ethereum can do. And I don't really like the Ethereum versus Bitcoin battle because I don't think it's an either or. I think what Bitcoin does, it does great and doesn't have to do a gazillion different things. But this is another thing that Bitcoin can do, as aside from being a store of value, is play a very key role in the remittance market, which is an enormous market across the globe. So, again, I think this is really significant news. I think for many people who have called for this, the whole idea of a Bitcoin standard, I think it's happening, sooner rather than people expected. And we'll just have to see, is this an anomaly, or does this really result in follow through from other nations?
I think that's a key point. Also, you've had a lot of talk and presumed steps, but it'll really be the implementation of that and how El Salvador embraces this and really incorporates it into their economy will be a critical test for Bitcoin, right? Because this is the first time at this scale that we'll see if Bitcoin can really live up to the promise that many people see. So despite being such a tiny nation, I think it's, 6 million citizens, I believe, $25 billion in GDP. I think we both agree that this is a massive event in the life of Bitcoin, and we'll see where it goes from here. Mr. President, if you're listening, I know you jumped onto Twitter last night. We'd love to have you on our Salt Talks and at Salt. So please let us know if you're interested. I want to stay on this topic a little bit and dig in a little bit more because I've taken a peek at the questions, and we'll take the questions at the end. But can you spend a little bit more time on the potential accounting implications from a corporate perspective or even capital gains? There's been some talk of that for individual investors. What's your view on that with this recent announcement?
Well, again, it's a bit of a TBD, but I think if you ended up in a situation where companies could market to market, as I said, instead of this sort of a tangibles tax treatment, there is the possibility that rather than being treated as a capital asset, that you would have to pay ordinary income tax on Bitcoin. So, I would say that there are definitely people in the community who are worried about that being sort of an adverse, unintended consequence. Now, just to give you the plus side of that, if we all of us that own at least 3 Bitcoin can move to El Salvador. We can become citizens of El Salvador. I hear the beach property is quite cheap. There's no property taxes and have no capital gains tax. Obviously I'm kidding. And I think, one of the things that's very attractive about Bitcoin is its tax treatment. Its tax treatment is better than gold, better than art. And we're just going to have to see on this. There's, the intellectually the framework is such that you would change the accounting treatment based upon this. I think we'll have to see if a nation of 6 million people doing something results in the largest economy in the United States changing the way it treats an asset. I mean, there's something, again, while it makes sense from a purely like law school legal standpoint, we'll see, we'll see what happens. I think we have to sort of stay tuned on that.
Well, we certainly expect there'll be more discussion around the developments in El Salvador, but for now, we'll leave it at that and move on to some of our other topics. So earlier this week, perhaps on the negative side, but you'll tell us, the Justice Department seized Bitcoin that was paid as ransom from the Colonial Pipeline hack. It was perhaps misreported, whether on purpose or not, by many in the mainstream media. But why don't you give us your rundown on what happened and whether it's negative or positive for Bitcoin.
Okay, it's massively positive. Like Bitcoin is being de-risked before our very eyes. So a week ago, there was a op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, which was actually, it took them a week longer than I thought to write it. Because when the Colonial Pipeline thing, when I read that they paid Bitcoin, I was like, oh, this is going to be bad. So now we're going to get, in fact, Elizabeth Warren at a subcommittee meeting today was peeing all over Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, playing out all the old tunes from 3 years ago about how it's used for crime, blah, blah, blah. Bitcoin is terrible for crime. Mike Morrell, the former director of the CIA, issued a report. Chain Analytics, which is a very respected forensic blockchain sort of law enforcement security firm, has said that Bitcoin illicit use activity is about 1% of overall transactions. This is another piece of evidence that Bitcoin is bad for crime. I've mentioned that after January 6th, the FBI found that there was some anarchist in France and he sent money to the Proud Boys, and it took him a week to track him down. So I view this as just, again, another sign of Bitcoin being de-risked. And I view that, like the China, there was some news today about, China continuing to crack down on mining, and the hash rate, which is the amount of computing power that is operating on the Bitcoin network, coming down a bit by virtue of that. Again, massively positive. The headlines, can be scary. China bans mining, Bitcoin hash rate declines. Okay. This is the de-risking of Bitcoin. It's the greening of Bitcoin, because as we get it out of the coal regions of China, wherever it goes, right, the overall energy mix of Bitcoin, right, becomes greener. And this sort of false narrative that, quote, China controls Bitcoin because of the amount of mining just goes away as you distribute that mining globally. And then, of course, El Salvador is another way that it's de-risked. Right? You have a nation, like this sort of internet money that we all laughed at several years ago that went up and crashed and somehow is still with us, is being recognized by governments as legal tender. Everyone on this call, whether they own Bitcoin or not, today can go on their phone. I bet there isn't a person on this call who doesn't have either a Venmo or a PayPal account, and they can buy Bitcoin. And it's just going to continue to get easier and easier. Anyway, that was my take. I guess what was yours? Because, Bitcoin has been trading until today pretty terribly. When this news came down, it traded down, which surprised me. Did you react differently to the news when you saw it?
And that was sort of why I introduced it almost tongue-in-cheek as negative news, because you've been obviously very consistent on all of these points, right? The Elon Musk, original Elon Musk issue, but more so the greening of Bitcoin with the reduction of mining out of China, this Justice Department news. You've strongly said all hugely positive for Bitcoin. Yet when you look at the price, which we all certainly do, probably more so than we should, the market arguably has viewed it as negative news. And whether it's CNBC or others in the mainstream media, it's been portrayed similarly as well. Now, that being said, to your point, it looks like pricing has rebounded. I'll take credit for that as the Jason Zen's bottom. And you always say, don't follow the price, follow the news. Easier said than done. Given the events that we've just talked about, it does feel like there's a shift in sentiment. Things got really, really bad, really negative. You had what seemed like some capitulation events to the downside in price. Do you think we've made a bottom here? I mean, do you think that El Salvador is perhaps a catalyst to turn this around?
Well, I want to take a step back because you made me feel bad, like I'm just a perma bull, which I don't want to be. It's like I own a lot of Bitcoin, and so because I do, it doesn't make me a cheerleader, although I want to get people engaged. It actually focuses me and makes sure that I'm evaluating it to the best if I can rationally. The focus on Bitcoin energy consumption, okay, has definitely had an adverse effect on institutional adoption. Okay, there are some number of institutions that pressed pause, right, because of all the attention. Okay, and look, ultimately at the end of the day, every market, right, responds to supply and demand, and it's very sentiment driven. What Bitcoin doesn't have, and the reason why I think the extremes, are such, is there's no like fundamental floor based on traditional financial analysis, right? So there's no one out there sitting there saying, well, if it gets to X times EBITDA, I'm buying it. I don't really care, right? Or you don't have that. So as it's falling, and it gets from 40 to 35. Could it go to 18? Sort of the fear and greed sort of takes over. So it has that was a negative. The other thing is that you have just momentum buyers into Bitcoin. And I can tell you, I've spoken to the NYDIG trading desk, and they have a lot of people who would rather pay 41 than 29. Okay, so they're sitting here waiting for it to stabilize. Right, and they're nibbling as it shows firmness, but when it shows weakness, they step away, and that's why we get these sort of gap down movements. I mean, it's a fucking crazy asset. Okay, it's like it trades like nothing I've seen before, and that's why there's such a brilliance to hodling. I'm sorry, I lost track of the original question.
That's good, and I think that's a good segue into some of the other developments in Bitcoin world today, which really relates to adoption, right? Like you mentioned, there's not really fundamentals, there's no earnings, there's no price to sales ratio, but we do have Metcalfe's law, we do have the network, we do have adoption, which is of course key to our thesis, and all signs on that side of the equation look very positive, right? And so as a piece of news that just came out today, the brokerage Interactive Brokers, it was reported, will be allowing crypto trading at some point this summer. That follows news that I think you've touched on in past weeks. Of course, Morgan Stanley rolling out a product, but JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo look to be in the queue. So give us your insight into the adoption story, including from a high net worth investor perspective.
Well, look, I think adoption is inherently tied to easy access. And so, I think what has happened with the various Bitcoin funds is that, people hear the story, they get interested, and then they get tied up in the documents, and they sort of lose interest, and it gets too complicated, and it's just not worth it for a small position that they're not that sure about, but are sort of interesting. And so the private fundraisers have been, I think, more challenging for the various people. So the easier you make it for people, the greater I think the adoption is. In the first quarter of this year, Square has its Cash App. So in addition to Venmo and PayPal, the Cash App is another very easy on Square. And Square had, for their first quarter, they had $5 billion in revenue, of which 3.5 was Bitcoin, transactions, people buying Bitcoin on Square. Interactive Brokers has announced today that this summer they will be the first brokerage firm, right, where you'll be able to just, in your brokerage firm, like you're buying Apple stock or a mutual fund, buy Bitcoin. Okay. After them, you'll be able to do it on E-Trade and Schwab, and eventually you'll be able to do it in your Morgan Stanley brokerage account. And again, I think the easier it becomes, the more widespread the adoption. And I guess, you're right. There, as we discussed, there's no like, well, I'll buy it this PE or, because this is where the cash flows are X. And you really do have to focus on the adoption. And at the Bitcoin conference, Tyler Winklevoss, when he was addressing the crowd, he said that there are 40,000 public companies in the world, and 32 public companies own Bitcoin. He rhetorically asked the crowd, do you think that number is going up or down? And so when Bitcoin is falling, and I'm getting a little nervous, even though I'm, trying to be Buddhist about it, I think, okay, well, I know 5 insurance companies that own over $100 million of Bitcoin. Do I think that number is going up or down? Okay. I know 5 endowments, okay, major endowments, Harvard, Michigan, Brown, Yale, that own Bitcoin. Do I think that number is going up or down? Okay. Hedge funds, right? We know a handful, up or down. Large asset managers like BlackRock and Guggenheim, is it going up and down? The number of individuals, right? There's about 125, 150. I mean, we think based on our projections, it's going to be $1 billion by 225. Set that aside. Is that number going up or down? All those numbers are going up, and they're going up big. And you have an asset with a fixed supply. I think there's something, Darwinian about Bitcoin. So I think people look at people who've made a lot of money in Bitcoin and say, oh, they got lucky. They just held the Bitcoin. Holding Bitcoin is hard. Okay. So, when Bitcoin gets to be 100,000 or 250,000, and my Bitcoin is worth a lot, like, I don't want to hear from anyone, oh, you just bought Bitcoin and put it away. It's like, it is hard to be a hodler. And so we're collectively in this together. So this is it, in part a Bitcoin support group.
I'll agree with you there. It's never easy, and certainly this last month or so with the sell-off has really tested the hodlers, as you say, and hopefully we're on the upswing here. The one other point I'll mention on adoption, I think important to look at it from an investment standpoint, but also really when it comes down to it as this network of money, digital money. The adoption in countries like El Salvador, even though it's 6 million people, you even onboard 10, 25% of the population that starts transacting every single day in Bitcoin. The law now requires every single merchant that operates in that country, which includes big multinationals, they're required to accept Bitcoin. The network effects from that, aside from investment and money flowing into Bitcoin.
Hold on, I have to make a point, Jason. So you know what that means? That means that Tesla have to accept Bitcoin in El Salvador, okay? So they can say they're not accepting Bitcoin. I don't know how many Teslas are getting sold in El Salvador, probably not a lot. But if they were, they'd have to accept Bitcoin.
Well, knowing the Bitcoin community and certainly the Bitcoin Twitter community, I imagine someone is probably on a flight down there right now to try and test that theory. And we'll eagerly await Elon's rebuttal or response, or really just his reaction. I mean, from the beginning, he has been on record as saying he believes in the potential power of Bitcoin to do good. And, again, as we've discussed, El Salvador is really the first test case of that. So it'll be interesting to see his reaction there.
I don't think I've shared my Elon Musk theory with the crowd. So, given, Anthony's not here, I'll have to keep people amused. So here's my Elon Musk theory. He cannot sell. Okay, so why can't he sell Bitcoin? Because if Elon Musk sells Bitcoin and Bitcoin goes to 500,000 or 1 million, he will never hear the end of it. Like, no one will want to hear him talk about space. No one will want to hear about his new car. Like, he will have to leave Twitter. Like, he will just be mocked constantly. So I think it's more likely that he does, people worry, is he going to sell? I'm sort of sick of him. If he wants to sell, it's fine. Although, if he wants to help Bitcoin, I'll embrace it. He's got enough other things to work on, between his various companies. It wouldn't surprise me if he just becomes sort of a hodler. And we don't hear that much about him. But we'll see.
We will certainly see. He's never one to shy away from controversy or publicity. And with the spotlight focused elsewhere, perhaps a tweet is imminent.
Well, I don't know if you saw, but Anonymous put a video out where they, challenged him, threatened him. People I talked to said that might have shaken him a bit. We'll see.
We'll see. He also just rolled out his new plaid model car, so certainly a lot on his hands. Let's finish up with the final topic. We've got a lot of questions in the queue as well, and that is a friend of Salt Talks, MicroStrategy's Michael Saylor, doing another raise at his company, this time a debt offering with the explicit purpose of buying Bitcoin. His first debt offering, the prior few were convertible offerings, originally targeted $400 million, upsized it to $500 million. It was reported there was $1.6 billion in demand. Give us some insight on that offering and the significance of it.
We can make this one short so we can get to questions. Michael Saylor, 2020 MVP of Bitcoin, making a run for 2021 Bitcoin. He's done a great job of evangelize, but also really working for Bitcoin, and he's working behind the scenes. And I think that the practical significance of this, being really pragmatic, is Bitcoin volumes are really light. So if you look at May volumes versus where they are now, they're less than half. CME open interest is down a lot. I mean, the market has gotten relatively thin, which is why Anthony and John aren't here, right? So having $500 million come into the market and clean up some loose supply is just as a supply-demand market dynamic standpoint helpful, right? And if you get a lift in the market, you draw those buyers at NYDIG who would rather buy at 41 than 29 coming in. So I think that's the most practical significance of it. There are 18.7 million approximately Bitcoin that have been issued to date. Of course, 21 ultimately. Of that 18.7, 2 to 4 million have been lost. And about 70% of it is HODLed, like mine. It doesn't trade. So the amount of Bitcoin that's actually trading, that is determining the price, really isn't that much. It's a fraction of the overall market cap. And so $500 million, $1 billion, it's real money. And so to me, that's the most significant effect. Is back to the Jason Zinn's bottom. I mean, Michael Saylor's buying could help put that in.
Well, I'm certainly rooting for him. And importantly, we've not seen confirmation of a purchase. Usually he's a public company, and in the past he has tweeted an aggregate purchase amount at a given price. We've not seen that yet. And I think you had some insight as to the mechanics of when that purchase may take place, given the debt offering.
Well, he announced that the deal closed yesterday. I know some of the buyers personally. They don't have to fund, so I think they're committed contractually. They don't fund until next week. So if he waits for the money to hit his account, he'll start buying next week. It's possible that Jefferies underwrote the offering. They could just bridge it to him and give it to him, early. He could be buying it at Coinbase, and Coinbase could bridge it to him, or he could wait. So I don't. To your point, he's going to buy it, I think, systematically over several days. I would expect an announcement from him, either early end of this week or end of next week, depending upon whether he got a bridge or he didn't.
Well, we'll certainly keep an eye out for that and see if there's any Saylor jump or Saylor bump in price as you've seen in the past. So with that, we've got a number of questions in the queue. The first one from Anonymous: what happened to Darcy? Did he get canned? I'll have to defer to Anthony, who is the personnel director here at SkyBridge, to comment. But no, John is on a well-deserved vacation and will probably be back next week, I would imagine. Some questions on El Salvador. We obviously spent some time on it, but one of the questions here is, what types of businesses, in addition to mining, which we should speak about, what types of businesses do you see going to El Salvador with this announcement? Exchanges, mining, et cetera?
Well, look, I think you're going to need, you have to connect, the El Salvador existing financial system right into the Bitcoin system. So, there will be room for, I guess, a a Coinbase of El Salvador, if you will. And then I think it's just going to be a very crypto-friendly environment. So there's a guy named Justin Sun who's big in the crypto community. He has a coin called Tron. Yeah, as people on this call know, we're not big fans of the altcoins, but he's going to be bringing a bunch of jobs to El Salvador. Look, El Salvador became super cool overnight. The mayor of Miami has made Miami cool for Bitcoiners, and I think you're going to see, look, remote work is being embraced. I think there are a lot of projects that can just be done there. It was just one last comment on sort of remote work. Samuel Bankman-Fried, which is a name that I think people will come to know, he founded a company called FTX. The Miami Heat Arena, which used to be called the American Airlines Arena, is now the FTX Arena. Samuel Bankman-Fried has made over $10 billion in like 2.5 years since he started this company. And he was tweeting from the Miami conference where he was one of the speakers, an excellent speaker. And he was talking about how one of the things he enjoyed about the conference was meeting people that work for FTX that he had never met before. So I think, we have to come to accept that, it's a different way of working. And I think particularly for people in the digital asset space, Coinbase doesn't have a headquarters anymore, like an official headquarters. So I think the range of people that'll be there, and I think you just have to remember, just to give you my city government experience, what they're looking for is the multiplier effect, right? So someone moves down there, they got to buy some real estate. They're going to need people to take care of their house. They got to buy food. They got to entertain, right? So that flow of money, right, just has a multiplier effect in terms of how it can help their economy and their broader community. It's really, as I said, he's my favorite pro-green, pro-Bitcoin dictator, but it's great public policy.
And I think that multiplier effect and the public policy component that you touch on is going to be critical, because if we wake up 6-12 months from now and El Salvador, which, there's violence, it's not like it's the best place on earth. If things have started to turn and the economy has started to turn, and the daily life for citizens improved, it's going to become impossible to ignore for bigger countries and much of the rest of the developed world. So only time will tell there. But certainly, whether you just monitor Twitter or listen to some of the public announcements that have been made, you're likely to see some segment of the Bitcoin community move down to El Salvador. Like you said, it sort of became cool overnight. It also became very attractive from a tax standpoint. And as we know, many in the Bitcoin community are sitting on very large capital gains. So we'll see who makes the plunge, and maybe John Darcy will be hosting these from Bitcoin Beach in the future.
This is one last comment on that. There's been some skepticism that El Salvador might be an outlier, and here's why I don't think it will be. There are just many nations that are like El Salvador, sort of quasi-democracies, right, where the president exerts a great deal of influence, and they don't have that much to lose. Right. El Salvador, right, is a nation that has had many, much struggles. Like, what was the downside to doing this for them? Almost nothing. Right. And so if you're the president of a similar nation with similar challenges, I follow this guy on Twitter. By the way, he's a pretty good follow. And every day he's saying and doing something interesting. You don't become a political leader without being a competitive guy. Like, I think just the competition and the low stakes, right? You run an African nation that's got great challenges. Why not be the first one on the African continent? It seems like a completely rational move.
So we'll try and run through a couple more questions here, and a lot of it's still on El Salvador. Are there any U.S. tax implications for El Salvador making Bitcoin legal tender? For instance, if I buy a Porsche with euros I've held for years, I don't think I have to pay capital gains. If I do that with Bitcoin, is it different?
let's just say TBD on the Bitcoin, as I said earlier. Actually, on the euros, you should pay taxes. No one does, and I'm not going to report you. But if you have, let's say, a couple $100 grand in euros, and they appreciate, and you convert and then buy a Porsche, that is actually a capital gain. And again, the government doesn't chase it down because the numbers probably aren't that large. And I think we're going to just have to see. Again, I think intellectually, and there probably should be some changes, but I'm just not sure that we're going to change our orientation towards Bitcoin based on one nation of 6 million people. I have to wait and see.
It'll be interesting to see any official response, if any, from the U.S. government. I did hear the president on his Twitter appearance last night say that both the U.S. and the IMF have been in touch with his government, and he's actually meeting with the IMF on Thursday. I think there are some outstanding issues already with the IMF, and so it'll be interesting to see if this changes anything.
Well, here's how I think this comes to a head. Is I think you're going to see a company will probably rumble with their accountants and say, "This is a foreign currency. We are treating it this way," and they're going to file financial statements, right, as part of either, a 10Q, or they're going to file tax returns, and the government's going to have to take a position. So I don't think the government has to say anything, right, until that happens, right? So it'll be interesting to see, because I imagine we will get a test case in the coming quarters.
One more question on this development in El Salvador. The question is, how can Bitcoin serve any country as a currency when it has such price volatility? I thought Bitcoin is an asset class, a digital asset, not a currency.
Well, look, what are the different ways that this could go? So let's think about what El Salvador is doing. They're going to have sort of two currencies. Bitcoin is legal tender in El Salvador, as is the US dollar. So, what someone who lives in El Salvador could do is, hold savings in Bitcoin and convert it to dollars. They now have this sort of two-track choices. And again, if the US dollar is going to get devalued, the volatility notwithstanding, Bitcoin is appreciating against the US dollar, right? I mean, it started being worth $0 or a penny per US dollar. Now it's $36,000 per US dollar. As it goes higher, it is appreciating against the US dollar. Again, for El Salvador, they have both. That's my personal view is how this plays out, is that, I think eventually as adoption proliferates in the United States, people will hold Bitcoin and US dollars. And for things like rent and, money you need available for expenses, you'll keep in US dollars because you won't want to deal with the volatility. And for assets that you don't need to tap immediately, you'd rather have an asset that's volatile, but you might find is 50% higher at the end of the year versus one that has been devalued by 12% over the course of the year.
And to get a little bit technical just for a moment, the way it'll work in El Salvador, as I mentioned, merchants will be required, and this goes into effect in 90 days, I believe, will be required to accept Bitcoin. That also goes as far as things like mortgage debt and other loans. And so to facilitate these, as you mentioned, sort of two-way transactions with almost two currencies going on, the president has said that through the development bank, they'll essentially create a trust that they fund from the government to facilitate these instantaneous Bitcoin to dollar transactions, so that you're not subject to the day-to-day volatility if you're being paid in Bitcoin but you want to hold US dollars. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out as well as far as the practical implementation. On paper, it sounds like an interesting solution. So we'll see how that plays out. But critically is it only works in a country like that because they've removed the taxation component, right? In the US, as you mentioned, you can do that really already with PayPal. You can transact technically in PayPal via Bitcoin, but for now, it is technically a taxable event. In El Salvador, it is no longer. And so we'll see how that sort of dual use case really develops.
I think the logical tax treatment in the U.S. would be to have a de minimis exception, right? So that you could have, call it $10,000 or $20,000 of transactions a year, right, that are non-taxable. And then above that, it becomes a long and short-term capital gain, depending upon your holding period, just because of how burdensome it may be for someone who's using it in regular commerce. And just to flesh out, Jason, what you were saying with respect to El Salvador, right? If I understand, tell me if I got this right. So I run the equivalent of a Starbucks in El Salvador. You come in and buy a cup of coffee. You give me Bitcoin. I don't want the Bitcoin. I can go to the government and swap that Bitcoin for dollars basically instantaneously. And so that's what this fund is being done, is so that me, the vendor, if I don't want to own the Bitcoin, I can accept it and swap it to dollars basically instantaneously, with the government facilitating that.
That's right. That is how the president explained it last night on Twitter, was that they'll be setting up this trust and a government wallet that will allow vendors to essentially and even automatically opt out and say, look, I'm happy to accept Bitcoin, but for right now, I don't want to hold Bitcoin. So the government has said they'll step in and make that transaction riskless and essentially take the Bitcoin, convert it to dollars at the same price, the same exchange as the merchant transaction. So really interesting plan. Kudos to them and to Jack Mallers, who seems like he was involved here, to come up with a practical solution to a real practical problem of as far as implementing this across the country.
Yeah, absolutely.
So with that, we're at the end of our time. It's been fun. Thanks for letting me join. June 9th, the Jason's Ends bottom. Let's hope that continues. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We'll be back next week, 4 p.m. Eastern, with the SkyBridge Bitcoin review. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, bitcoinir@skybridge.com. Thank you.